Good morning. I'm Jeff Grigsby, and I want to talk to you about endangered species habitat and the effect of some of the protective legislation out there. We all know that extinction is accelerating, and there are 5 drivers for that as determined by the UN. Number 1 is changes in land and sea use. We've discussed that. We see that. Direct exploitation of organisms, which could be hunting, fishing, overfishing, overhunting. Climate change, pollution, we talked about soil demineralization, and invasive species. And we're going to talk about this in respect to looking at 2 different woodpeckers. The first being the ivory-billed woodpecker, which is extinct at this point. Its habitat was large, undisturbed southern swamps and the margins that they had with pines. And so you'd see the vegetation on one side that was common to swamps and the other that was common to pines, and they sort of lived in that area of transition in between the two. It said that they have about 6 miles of range. Their food included a lot of different things, beetles, actually including the southern pine beetle, fruits and nuts. They built their nest in dead trees or dead sections of living trees, usually 50, 70 foot above the ground. Their nests were quite large, 45 inches wide, 5 to 6 inches tall. Inside it could be as deep as 2 feet deep. They built a new nest every year. And so other birds or animals would use their nest after they moved out of them. It became rather obvious that they were becoming extinct, and the last official reporting was in 1941 at what's now the Tensas River National Wildlife Refuge, which is just across the river, not too far from Vicksburg, Mississippi. There was a tract of land, 81,000 acres, that was owned by the Singer Sewing Machine Company. And they had determined that they were going to cut the land. Word got out. Some people tried to stop it. Cornell Laboratory and the National Audubon Society appealed to Franklin Roosevelt, but in the early 1940s, as you can well imagine, Franklin Roosevelt had other issues to deal with. But there were another group of people who were well-known ornithologists, and one was the bird curator of the American Museum of Natural History, Frank Chapman, who also started the Christmas bird count, which will go on here over in toward the middle to beginning, actually, of December. William Brewster was a leading ornithologist, and both encouraged shooting in collection. In other words, if they're going to die out, let's just collect all we can as specimens. And Brewster actually personally shot some ivory-billed birds. Well, after a third try, there were 2 bills that proceeded that passed Congress that were rather lukewarm. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 passed, and it really changed a lot of things as far as what was going on as far as protections with endangered species. So it listed first things that we really all knew but perhaps didn't think about, that economic growth and development untampered by adequate concern and conservation had caused many species to be either in danger or threatened with extinction. That there was a reason to protect these animals for aesthetic, ecological, educational, historical, recreation, and scientific value to the nation and its people. That we already had treaties with other countries. In fact, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918 actually also protected the ivory-billed woodpecker, but it protected, even though it wasn't a migratory bird, it protected other birds that were not migratory. Well, if you get into a little bit of more depth with the Endangered Species Act, if you look at Section 2C, and it is further declared to be the policy of the Congress that all federal departments and agencies shall seek to conserve endangered and threatened species and shall utilize all their authorities. Okay, so all federal departments and agencies. And then if you go to Section 7, that each federal agency will concur with the Secretary, meaning the Secretary of Interior, on any project that they have that might be have the ability to change these, either kill these animals or ruin their habitat. And when the Endangered Species Act passed, it really seemed rather benign, and there was not a lot of objection to it until this point, when they were building the last dam on the Tennessee River, which was a hydroelectric project. They'd already spent the Tellico Dam. They'd already spent $78 million. It was nearly complete. And an ichthyologist found a small little fish called a snail darter. And if the dam was completed, it would destroy the habitat of the snail darter, and the snail darter would certainly go away. So everyone just assumed when a court case was filed that the Supreme Court would rule in favor of finishing the dam, but they didn't. And so when they didn't file in favor of supporting the dam, they said that the Endangered Species Act could not be disregarded in this case. And all of a sudden people realize, oh, there's something here. These animals really do have protection. Well, Congress got around it. They passed an appropriations bill, and what they did was they made the Tellico Dam exempt from the Endangered Species Act. So they got around it. But nonetheless, people understood there is really something here. Section 3, the word take, becomes a big issue which follows through in some programs that we see quite frequently today. So in Section 3, take means to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, collect, or to attempt to engage in any such conduct. The Secretary of the Interior had previously interpreted take as kill, but what's known as the Sweet Home case, Sweet Home versus Babbitt, the courts ruled that take could also be interpreted as harm, and to harm a species, all you had to do was mess up its habitat. And so all of a sudden, where this had seemed to apply only to the government, it now seemed that it applied to individuals, because if they messed up their species, they could cause harm to these different species. So, Section 2, we talked about take, and it became, when it was interpreted as harm, and harm was interpreted as damaging their habitat, it changed things. And landowners felt that they were subject to the penalties of the of the Endangered Species Act. And so there were many what we are referred to as safe harbor management agreements, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. Also, it gave more strength to the habitat conservation plans, in which now cities and utilities and areas, when they wish to develop a little further, had to go over and negotiate agreements and work out habitat for these different species. Section 4 dealt with endangered or threatened species, and there's really not a lot of difference. The main thing is with threatened species, the Fish and Wildlife Service has a little bit more latitude as far as they can do to handle that. We talked about Section 7. Section 9 codified some things that had already been done with some of the previous acts as far as trade of endangered species. So what happened? All of a sudden, private landowners felt liable, and there was a case in North Carolina of a gentleman by the name of Ben Cohn who decided he was going to cut some of his old growth forest. The problem was those forests contained endangered species. So when he cut those, he was threatened with jail time and fines. And so his landowners who had old growth forest and did not have these endangered species on those, all of a sudden cut all their habitat. And so there was no old growth forest around there because they didn't want to take the risk of losing, as they felt, control of their property. So the mantra of many became shoot, shovel, and shut up. And unfortunately, that still prevails a lot even today. So how well did the Endangered Species Act work? And if you look at this slide, you see the gray and the black. Gray is where areas, the species numbers were stable. Black is where they actually improved. White is where they declined. So is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? If you look a little further, at figure 2, you notice that there are some decliners, there are some gainers, but at a certain point of time, these species tend to either stay stable or they tend to increase. So it seemed to improve over time. And so in other words, the key was, if you have an endangered species, get them covered by the act, get them named as being threatened or endangered as soon as possible. So safe harbor agreements, and this is just an example of a brochure that's sent by the state of Louisiana concerning the red cockaded woodpecker. The red cockaded woodpecker's preferred habitat was longleaf pine forests that were burned periodically. Well, we all know that those don't exist as much anymore. But actually, the red cockaded woodpecker would live in any yellow pine species. It preferred older pines. The only reason it liked the longleaf preferably is because they produce more sap, and the sap ran down the outside of the tree. When climbing snakes would try to come up, it would block those from getting into the cavity where the woodpeckers lived. So they liked older trees, had a little bit of heartwood decay, had less resin in the center. The red cockaded woodpecker is the only woodpecker that will actually make a cavity in a living tree, but it takes them more than a year to make one. So when they're, unlike the ivory bills, who only use theirs for 1 year, the red cockaded woodpeckers will use theirs for several years. They don't like any mid-story over 7 foot. They like rather thinnish basal areas of about 40 to 60 feet, little hardwood encroachment, abundant foraging habitat with grasses and forbs. A definition that you need to know: PBGs, potential breeding groups, which usually one male, one female, and usually the male offspring for the last couple of years would also be in that group. The female offspring would go other places and I guess become the female of that group. So, threats to recovery. Well, one is inbreeding. So the female offspring would leave the nest. That would help. If there were a female and mother birds and the male died, then that female would leave the nest also. So how do you protect against this homozygosity or inbreeding? Is if you at least have 40 potential breeding groups, it seemed to be somewhat protective. If you had a couple of migrants come in from that year, which is why that people now translocate these birds, it seemed to give even more protection. If you had at least 100 potential breeding groups, then it seemed to be resistant against demographics. So chastity, remember that's the one, birds, they have a good crop of birds, you have a few die, and it just protects against that. 250 potential breeding groups can withstand environmental stochasticity. In other words, the storms come through, wind throw, some of the birds are lost. Genetic drift. We talked about that translocation helped with that, and there's some active products. There's a good video I've listed here by the Texas A&M Forest Service. Just put that in red-cockaded woodpecker, and you'd pull that up in YouTube, and I would suggest you look at that. So how were they harmed? What potential did landowners have to show harm with these? One is removing any tree that had a cavity for red-cockaded woodpeckers, damaging that tree, using insecticides around that tree, constructing roads or utilities, constructions of facilities, planting shrubs exceeding 7 feet. So if you sign a safe harbor group, how are you protected as a landowner? So an assessment is done, and it's determined how many red-cockaded woodpecker groups, PBGs, potential breeding groups, do you have on your property? If the answer is 0, that's your baseline. You don't have to maintain habitat for those. And so you can move on and do whatever you want to. If you do have a group, your goal is you're not expected to increase, you're expected to maintain those. So by expected to maintain those means that you have to maintain some habitat around those, about 200 feet around the nesting area, all total including foraging area about 75 acres that you need to maintain at that habitat like we talked about earlier. And so that becomes your goal. Now, that 75 acres can move if you want to harvest some of the timber, but you're looking at longer rotations, using planting with the state biologist to help move those around so that you always maintain those 75 acres. Thank you.